Hi everyone, welcome to General Psychology. We'll be using David Myers' Exploring Psychology for this semester to introduce you to the discipline of psychology. Be sure you listen to the introductory video for this course, and all of the information that you need for this course will come through pages and through announcements. So be sure you check your announcements on a regular basis and look at pages. Go to the top left of pages. After you click on it, you'll see a blue box. So each chapter will be a page in and of itself. So welcome to fall semester, and we're going to dive right into introductory psychology. What is psychology? The word psyche is from the Greek and it means mind. And logos means the study. So hundreds of years ago, we talked about the study of the mind. In contemporary psychology, we define it as the scientific study of both behavior and mental processes. So currently we study mental processes like thinking, processing information, perceiving, dreaming, etc., as well as overt behavior, and it's done scientifically. There are four classic goals of psychology: description, understanding, prediction, and on the next slide you'll see the word control. So all scientific psychology starts with scientific observation. So we answer psychological questions by naming and classifying behavior, and we do this by making observations. So we describe a behavior. So let's say we begin to observe that there tends to be more aggressive acts committed during summer months than at other times of the year. So we collect data. We go to different data sources and we go back, let's say 20 years, collecting data. And so we describe behavior tends to be more aggressive during summer months. Then, after we describe a behavior, we want to explain what caused it to happen. We want to understand. So why is it that people are more aggressive during the summer? Okay, once we understand a behavior, then we can predict. Okay, we strive to forecast when that behavior will happen again. The fourth goal of psychology is control or modification. So if we understand the causes of behavior, then as psychologists, we strive to create ways for changing that behavior. So for example, anxiety attacks. We create different types of interventions to help decrease anxiety attacks, hopefully eliminate them altogether so that people can function more appropriately and without as much distress. Contemporary psychology uses the scientific method to achieve these four goals. And so the second half of this chapter deals with the scientific method. Now, King Psamtik I, according to one of the authors of your textbook, David Myers, actually conducted the first recorded psychological experiment. He was the king of Egypt, as you see on the slide, in the 7th century BCE. So King Psamtik thought that the original language of all humanity was Egyptian. So he wanted to test out his hypotheses. So what he did, as the ethical king he was kidnap 2 young infants at birth and had his people take these young infants into the desert, and they were to hear no language. And he believed that the first word uttered by one of these children would be in the language of, or would be the original language of all people. So around age 2, one of the children spoke his first word, and that word was Bekos, B-E-C-O-S, and that was Phrygian for bread. So his conclusion was that his hypothesis was not correct and that the original language of all humankind was Phrygian. Psychology has its roots in two disciplines, philosophy and physiology. Psychology did not become a scientific discipline until the 19th century. Prior to that, people were asking psychological questions, primarily in the disciplines of philosophy and physiology. Buddha and Confucius, back around 500 BCE, were using the principles of logic to try to understand the mind and various mental processes. A couple of centuries later, Socrates and Plato contended that the mind was separate from the body and that the mind continued after death. They also believe that knowledge is innate and that as we grow and mature, knowledge comes forward as needed. So again, keep in mind that these philosophers were very much interested in the questions later psychologists were, but to understand these mental phenomena, they used the principles of logic, not the scientific method. Aristotle, unlike Socrates and Plato, relied on careful observation. So Aristotle was really the precursor of the modern scientist. He thought that the mind and body are not separate. And so, if the mind and body are not separate, then everything psychological is simultaneously biological. So as you're thinking right now, you are changing your biology. Okay, so Aristotle has theories about all kinds of psychological phenomena, how we learn, personality, emotion. We don't agree today with a lot of his theories, but his significance in psychology is that he asked very good questions. And so good science is about asking the right questions. It wasn't until the 16th century that philosophers furthered Aristotle's understanding of the mind. And so we see René Descartes. People who don't know a lot about Descartes oftentimes know one thing, and that's the quote, "I think, therefore I am." So Descartes went back to an agreement with Socrates that the mind and body are actually separate. He thought that we were born with knowledge, that ideas are innate. But what he's most noteworthy for in the history of psychology is that he was a scientist. This was pretty unique in his day. He dissected animals in order to understand the mind and mental processes. And in dissecting animals, he concluded that animal spirits flowed through the nerves to the muscles to produce movement. Now, we don't talk about animal spirits, and we know that this is not correct, but he was conducting experiments and using observation to understand how the mind and body work. So the next philosopher is John Locke in the 1600s. John Locke disagreed with Descartes. He did not believe knowledge is innate. He thought the mind was a blank slate at birth, and he termed this tabula rasa. So knowledge, he said, originates in our experience. And we know that today. So as we read, as we think about things, as we, engage in different activities, we gain knowledge. Now, this marks the beginning of empiricism. So psychology is an empirical science. In empiricism, we collect data. First we observe, and then we collect data in order to understand a phenomenon. So this is different from using the principles of logic. So science must rely on observation and experimentation. Wilhelm Wundt and his psychology graduate students studied what they called the atoms of the mind by conducting various experiments at the University of Leipzig in 1879. So you only need to memorize one date this semester in psychology, and that is 1879. It marks the beginning of contemporary psychology as we know it today. So what Wundt and his graduate students were doing was studying lag time or reaction time. So you see someone sitting at a table and he was instructed to press a lever when he heard a ball hit a platform. And so the psychologists were measuring the time between the event and the subject's perception of the event. The ball would hit a table or a platform, and there would be a lag time between the ball actually hitting the table and the subject's perception of that sound. So there were two early branches of psychology, structuralism and functionalism. And from this point forward, when I have nothing more to say about a slide other than what's written on it, you will not see a button for audio. You can just read that, and I'll go on in the next slide to give you further information. Kitchener was a student of Wundt, and he was interested in the structure of the mind. So he used a technique called introspection to discover the mind's structure. So he trained people to be introspectionists. So his trainees would ask subjects when they were presented with a stimulus, what they saw, heard, smelled, felt, what images occurred, etc. And this technique soon waned because it was quite unreliable. It was like trying to understand a car only by examining its disconnected parts, and the technique wasn't very scientific. William James is associated with functionalism. He was influenced by Charles Darwin, and he was interested in what function thoughts, feelings, and behaviors serve. So how do these things, these psychological thoughts, feelings, behaviors, help our ancestors survive? What is the function? So consciousness and mental processes help us survive and adapt to our environment. Okay, he's a famous psychologist in the history of psychology. He was both a philosopher and a psychologist who studied at Harvard and then worked at Harvard. He had a famous brother, Henry James, who was a famous novelist. He wrote The Turn of the Screw, The Portrait of a Lady, Daisy Miller, etc. So William James is known in education, philosophy, and in psychology. He's one of the great founders of this discipline. So William James is known for writing an important textbook in psychology. It was published in 1890. And he's also well known for his admitting the first woman student, Mary Calkins, to Harvard University and became her tutor. So Mary Calkins heard about the great William James, and she asked if she could join his graduate seminars, and he agreed. And when she joined the seminars, all the male students quit. Um, she finished her graduate training with William James and outscored all of her male colleagues on the qualifying exams. But Harvard University wanted Mary Calkins to get her degree from Radcliffe. At that time, Radcliffe was Harvard's sister school. And Mary Calkins refused to get her degree from Radcliffe. She studied at Harvard, and she was awarded her PhD from Harvard posthumously. So 50 years later, she was granted her degree. So it's interesting, she was the only female student at that time at Harvard in psychology, and now women hold about 2/3 of doctoral degrees in psychology. We seem to have an ebb and flow of males and females in the discipline. In the last decade or so, we're seeing more males go to graduate school in psychology and become psychologists. So the famous Sigmund Freud lived from 1856 to 1939, just to put him in context. He was an Austrian physician. He was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, but he influenced the discipline of psychology. He and his followers emphasized the importance of the unconscious mind and the effects it had on human behavior. Okay, so the unconscious mind is the part of the mind that functions outside of our awareness. What we don't want to remember, Freud said, we repress into our unconscious. So trauma, things we're not proud of. And Freud believed that we're largely motivated by our unconscious, that oftentimes we don't know why we do what we do, and we can get psychological symptoms because of this repression of unwanted events or material into our unconscious mind. And so Freud's goal in his psychoanalytic psychotherapy was to bring to consciousness that which we repressed into the unconscious mind. Now it's interesting, there's a little story that Freud was said to say that there are 3 blows to the self-esteem by humankind. The first, he said, was delivered by Copernicus. Copernicus said the earth is not the center of the world. The second blow to the self-esteem of humankind was Darwin. Darwin said we evolved from lower forms of life, that we are not a special creation of God. And then, to give you an idea of Freud's personality, he said, and I delivered the third blow, saying that the unconscious is really important, that we largely do not understand ourselves. We largely do not understand why we do what we do. The behaviorist developed, in large part, in opposition to psychoanalytic or Freudian theory. They didn't believe that studying the unconscious mind was scientific. You couldn't prove, nor could you disprove Freud's theory. So they believed the only part of human behavior that we could study scientifically was observable or overt behavior. So you see on the slide 2 famous psychologists, behaviorists. On the left you see John Watson, and on the right Skinner. So I'll talk more about these 2 men as we move forward. So Watson was influenced by a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov was studying salivation in dogs. He was a physiologist, and he noticed that when he walked into the room with some meat powder, the dog would start to drool. He would start to salivate even before he had the meat in his mouth. He also observed that the dog learned that as Pavlov was walking down the hall, he would begin to salivate because he associated the sound of Pavlov's walking with a good eating experience. So this is what we call classical conditioning or associational learning, and we'll learn more about this in the chapter on learning. So Watson employed the techniques of classical conditioning, and his famous experiment is that with little Albert. And on the previous slide, you see him with his assistant, Rosalie Rayner, working with a little boy named Little Albert. And little Albert was a pretty psychologically and physically healthy young infant. And he wasn't afraid of animals. They gave him a white rabbit, a white mouse, and he would pet the animal and laugh. And then what Watson did was pair the white rabbit with a loud, scary sound. And he did this a number of times. And pretty soon thereafter, when Albert was given a white animal, Albert would cower in fear because he associated the animal now with something scary. So this is what we call classical conditioning. Skinner was interested in a different type of learning. Okay, conditioning is the same thing as learning. So Skinner was interested in operant conditioning. He says a behavior operates on an environment and produces some result. The behaviors that reoccurred or cease to occur do so because of what happens after the behavior occurs. So if a child engages in a behavior and is rewarded, then the child's likely to repeat that behavior. If a child engages in a behavior and is punished, then the child is not as likely to engage in that behavior again. So this is operant conditioning, and again, we'll talk more about this in the chapter on learning. The next school of psychology is that of humanistic psychology. You see the two big names in humanism, Maslow on the left and Rogers on the right. Okay, this school developed in reaction to both behaviorism and to psychoanalytic theory, Freudian theory. And so Maslow and Rogers thought that the whole person needs to be studied. Okay, they emphasized current environmental influences on our growth potential and on our need for love and acceptance. So when we get into the chapter on personality and therapy, I'll talk more about Maslow and Rogers. Maslow is famous for his hierarchy of needs, that all of us as human beings have similar needs, beginning with basic survival needs and moving up the pyramid to the very top, which is a need for self-actualization. And he believed that these were inborn needs and tendencies. Carl Rogers focused on human growth, unlike Freud, who focused on human pathology. And Rogers believed that we only needed 3 conditions for growth and change, that these were necessary, but also sufficient. So he talked about genuineness, unconditional positive regard or non-judgment, and empathy. And if a therapist gives a client these three things: genuineness, unconditional, positive regard, and empathy, a person will move toward growth. Now, humanism is criticized because it's a bit too optimistic. We know now that a parent or a therapist could give a child or a client all three of those conditions, and it may not be sufficient for growth and change. The next development in psychology is that of cognitive psychology. And so the study of behavior is considered to be important by cognitive psychologists, but they also believe that we need to consider mental processes, that we don't understand the full human being if, like the behaviorists contend, we just study overt behavior. So they believe we need to study mental processes. So sensations, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, etc. Now, the cognitive psychologists suggested new methods for treating people suffering from psychological disorders. You see two names on the slide, Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis. Excuse me. Beck was a clinical psychologist, and he observed that his depressed clients tended to think in negative ways, and these negative patterns of thinking led to feelings of depression. And so in the chapter on therapy, we'll look in more detail at Beck's therapy for depression. Albert Ellis also was a clinician, and he too had a cognitive spin on depression and how to help people shift their thoughts so that they wouldn't feel so depressed. Now, the newest branch of cognitive psychology is cognitive neuroscience. So what they look at, cognitive neuroscientists examine brain activity that underlie cognitions. The next fields of psychology, subfields of psychology, are evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. So the nature-nurture debate began in ancient Greece. So Plato thought that most behaviors were due to nature or to biology. So he thought we inherited personality, we inherited IQ, and some of our ideas are innate as well. Aristotle, on the other hand, was a proponent of nurture, of experience. So he thought everything comes from experience. Charles Darwin, who published Origin of the Species in 1859, pondered variations in different species, and he proposed evolution by way of natural selection. So he said nature selects traits that are adaptive and that enable an organism to survive. Now, the focus of evolutionary psychology today is the relative contribution of biology and experience. So it's not whether a behavior is just determined biologically or just by way of nurture or experience, but there's a contribution from both biology and experience, and we look at that relative contribution. Now, behavioral genetics focuses on our diversity. So we're diverse because of differing genes and differing environments. So behavioral genetics studies the power and limits of genetics and environmental influences. So the saying goes, nurture works on what nature endows. The next two subfields of psychology include cross-cultural psychology and gender psychology. Now, much psychological research over the decades has been done on what we call weird cultures. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at some of the research. We want to look at the population that was studied. So cultures involve shared ideas and behaviors that have been passed from one generation to the next. So our culture shapes many behaviors. We'll talk about this more in discussion. Culture can shape standards of promptness, standards of honesty or self-disclosure. It can shape our attitudes toward sexual orientation, premarital sex, body size, body shape, our tendency to be formal or casual, eye contact, conversational distance, etc. Now, in spite of differences, we're also united by a shared biological heritage. So we share the same underlying processes. So for example, learning disorders involve the same brain dysfunction no matter what culture the person is from. Now, there are some differences. People in different cultures may vary in feelings of loneliness, but across culture, loneliness is exaggerated by shyness. So I want you to be thinking about culture and its influence on behavior for a discussion group. So multicultural psychology is a subfield, a really important subfield today, and it's a course on some college campuses and definitely a course that is taken in graduate studies in clinical psychology. So we're all, in some respects, like everyone else. So that's due to our human nature or our biology. Okay, we're all like some others. So this is due to cultures, and in some respects, we're like no other, and that makes us unique. Now, gender also influences behavior, as you know. Gender differences occur in how we express and detect emotion. Okay. Gender differences account for the risk for substance disorders and depression and eating disorders. We know there are gender differences in conversation. In general, females engage in conversation to build relationships versus men who tend to engage in conversation to share information and to give advice. And so one of the things we'll talk about in discussion is, how is this helpful to know? Think about various gender differences, culture differences, and how this is helpful for people to know about. So, apart from differences, we also share many things in common. Males and females, share the same age at which we crawl and walk. There's some universal commonalities. One of the newer subfields of psychology is positive psychology. Here at Thomas More, we have a course on positive psychology. So Martin Seligman began this subfield of psychology, and he was interested in what made happy people happy. And happiness is a somewhat elusive word. So he talks about subjective well-being, a sense that we're okay with ourselves and our lives as they are. Okay, so he uses the scientific method to explore the building of a good life. So Martin Seligman thought that so much of psychology looked at psychopathology, at dysfunction, and he wanted to look at the flip side of the coin to see what the ingredients of a good life is all about. So this is an interesting subfield of psychology, and I'll be talking about this in more depth later on in the semester. Most professions have organizations or associations. And so these associations or organizations serve to protect the profession. They also serve to protect the public. Most associations have codes of ethics that professionals need to abide by. Organizations are also a way in which professionals come together and share the latest research and examine various issues that are important at that time in history. So in psychology, the APA, the American Psychological Association, is the largest organization of psychology, and it has more than 160,000 members worldwide. The second largest is the British Psychological Association or Society. So most psychologists belong to either the American Psychological Association or the more experimentally oriented psychologists sometimes are members of APS, the American Psychological Society, which is geared toward experimental psychology. Psychology has some big questions, or what some people call fundamental and powerful concepts. Okay, one of these we looked at a bit earlier, and that is empiricism. So psychology is an empirical science. Okay, the early philosophers used logic to try to understand behavior and mental processes, but we now use empirical methods, scientific methods. We observe and collect and analyze data to understand psychological phenomenon. Another big question or another powerful concept is that of nature and nurture. So, as I said before, we're looking here at the controversy over the relative contributions of biology and experience. And so when we study abnormal psychology, we'll be looking at what is called the diathesis stress model. And this model takes into account both nature and nurture. The model suggests that people have a diathesis for a particular psychological disorder or disorders, and when they're under a lot of environmental stress, these genes activate and we see symptoms. So I'll talk more about that in the chapter on psychological disorders. Another fundamental concept in psychology is that of the biopsychosocial model. We'll be talking about this periodically throughout the semester. So this model says that there are three basic influences on any behavior or mental process. So this is a little bit more detailed than the nature-nurture concept. So you see on the slide biological influences. So we look at genetic predispositions, genetic mutations, natural selection of adaptive biology and behaviors, genes responding to the environment. We also have psychological influences on any behavior or mental process. So learned fears or other learned expectations, emotional responses, cognitive processing, and our perceptions. Social and cultural influences might include the presence of others, cultural, societal, and family expectations, peer and other group influences, and compelling models. Today, especially the media. Psychology subfields can be divided into two basic subfields, research and applied. And so on this slide and the next, you'll see pie charts of the different subfields of research psychology, and on the next slide, applied psychology. So take some time to look at this pie chart and the next pie chart to see where the different fields, subfields of psychology lie. So in the research area of psychology, we have experimental psychologists who specialize in the different fields you saw on the pie chart. In the applied subfields, we see these four different types of psychologists on the slide. So you see the clinical psychologist who studies, assesses, and treats people with various psychological problems and disorders. Now, some people go into counseling psychology, and it focuses on academic, vocational, and marital challenges. We have people in educational psychology who study and help people in schools and educational settings. We also have IO psychologists, industrial organizational psychologists, who study and advise on behavior in the workplace. Here at Thomas More, we call that course workplace psychology. So some of our graduates go on to get a degree in IO psychology, and they work usually with large organizations or businesses and helping them with various management issues or behavioral issues in the workplace. It's important to be able to differentiate between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist. Okay, a clinical psychologist gets a PhD, a doctorate in psychology, or a PsyD, a doctorate in clinical psychology, and they study, assess, and treat people who are suffering from various problems, various disorders using psychotherapy. A psychiatrist, on the other hand, are medical doctors, an MD or it could be a DO, who use treatments like drugs and psychotherapy to treat psychologically upset people. And so the training is basically the difference. The clinical psychologist gets a doctoral degree in psychology. The psychiatrist gets an MD or a DO, a doctor of osteopathy. So they are physicians. Psychologists think critically when they ask and answer questions. So in the second part of this chapter, we'll be looking at how psychologists use the scientific method to ask and answer questions. We'll be looking at descriptive studies, correlational studies, and experimentation. Many people have questions about their own behavior and the behavior of others, and with the hopes of satisfying their curiosity, many people will turn on talk radio counselor shows. They'll go to psychics to learn about other people as well as themselves. But these are unexamined sources of information about behavior. How can we differentiate between uninformed opinions and examined conclusions? We do this by using science. So the science of psychology helps make these examined conclusions, and this leads to our understanding of how people feel, think, and act as they do. Many people believe that intuition and common sense are enough to bring forth answers regarding human nature and human behavior. Intuition and common sense are important in aiding inquiries, but they're not free from error. There are two phenomena, the hindsight bias and the overconfidence bias, that illustrate why we can't rely solely on intuition and common sense to understand behavior. So the first is the hindsight bias, the I knew it all along phenomenon. Okay, so after learning the outcome of an event, many people believe that they could have predicted that very outcome. Okay, we only knew that the .com stocks would plummet after they actually did plummet. Okay, the Second World Trade Center building. People said we should have evacuated it immediately after the first one was hit on 9/11. Okay, this is hindsight. Hindsight can be 20/20. So this is similar to Monday morning quarterbacking. Our thinking can be limited by our reliance on common sense and by our tendency to be overconfident. And we call this the overconfidence bias. So sometimes we think we know more than we actually know. And so unfortunately, you see the answers on the screen to the anagrams, but people were asked how long they thought it would take to unscramble the anagrams on the left. And most people said it would take about 10 seconds, but yet on average they took about 3 minutes. So an example of the overconfidence bias. In one study on the overconfidence bias, a researcher asked college students at the beginning of the semester to make some predictions about some of their behaviors. So for example, did they think they would vote in the upcoming election? Did they think they would call their parents at least twice a week? Did they think they would drop a course, etc.? So they made various predictions, and then they were asked how confident they were in those predictions. And the students were 84% confident in making various predictions. So later on, when they were questioned, the predictions were true only about 71% of the time. So just keep in mind that hindsight bias and overconfidence can lead us to overestimate our intuition and common sense. So scientific inquiry can help us sift reality from illusion. This is not mentioned in your book, but we need to be aware of our cognitive set, not only in doing psychological or scientific research, but just in general. Cognitive set can either help us or hinder us. So I'm going to give you a brain teaser. It's not on the slide or in your book, so you need to listen very carefully. And I want you to listen to the brain teaser and see what the poet is referring to. This is an excerpt from a poem by Lord Byron. I'm not an earth, nor the sun, nor the moon. You may search all the sky, I'm not there. In the morning and evening, though not at noon, you can plainly perceive me, for like a balloon, I am suspended in air. So I'm going to stop right there. There's another verse or two. But think about what he's referring to. So I'll give you the answer. The answer is the letter I. I'm not an earth or sun or the moon. You can search all the sky. I'm not there. And then at the end, you may plainly perceive me, for like a balloon, I am suspended in air. So most of us weren't looking for a letter in a verse of a poem. So now I'm going to read you another poem and tell me what this poet is referring to. The beginning of eternity, the end of time and space, the beginning of every end, the end of every place. So what was that poet referring to? Okay, so I suspect some of you guessed correctly, and the answer is E. So the second one is much easier to answer because we've developed a cognitive set. We just answered a letter, and so in this case, we're more predisposed to look for a letter. So our cognitive set is the lens through which we view things, our perspective. So this can apply to a lot of things. This can explain prejudice. It can explain all kinds of errors in scientific research, among other things. I'll talk more about cognitive set as we go through the semester. So we want to be open-minded as psychologists, as researchers, as people in general, so that we don't end up with illusions about reality because our cognitive set is so narrow. We need to be aware of researcher bias and cognitive set. We may see what we expect to see. So for example, we may perceive depressed subjects' neutral comments as self-disparaging, because that's what we expect to see. So to check biases, psychologists use what we call operational definitions. So operational definitions are concrete and specific, and they're stated in measurable terms. So let's say you're doing a study on aggression. You would need to define what aggression is very concretely and in measurable terms so that someone else can replicate your research exactly the way you are conducting it. And so we want replication so that we can have confidence in the reliability of the findings of any study. And so we adopt the scientific attitude. You see on the slide, it's composed of curiosity. So we want people to be passionate in exploring their topic. We want them to be skeptical. We want them to doubt and question as they design their research and as they conduct and analyze their research. And humility, the ability to accept responsibility when they're wrong. I won't go into this, but there are examples of research where people, tweak the findings so that they end up confirming their hypothesis. And so this is highly unethical. We don't want that. People need to be humble. Sometimes our hypotheses are not confirmed in the studies that we conduct. So oftentimes we start with theories when we're doing research. So a theory, as you know, is an explanation that integrates principles and organizes and predicts behavior or events. And so if we were to observe that depressed people talk about their past, present, and future in a gloomy manner, we may theorize that low self-esteem contributes to depression. A hypothesis is a testable prediction, and oftentimes it's prompted by a theory. Not always, but oftentimes. And it enables us to either accept, reject, or revise the theory. So in this case, our hypothesis is people with low self-esteem are apt to feel more depressed than people with average or high self-esteem. Research would require us to administer tests of self-esteem, excuse me, and test of depression. So people who score low on a self-esteem test and high on a depression test would confirm our hypotheses. Our hypothesis was people with low self-esteem are apt to feel more depressed. There are different types of scientific methods used by psychologists to conduct research. So you see we have three basic types: descriptive studies, correlational studies, and experiments. Now, descriptive studies have three types. There are case studies, surveys, and naturalistic observations. And I'll talk about each one of these in detail in each of the following slides. The first category of research studies are descriptive methods, and they do exactly what the title says. They describe behavior. So descriptive studies do not explain cause and effect. They don't tell us why something has happened or a person has behaved a certain way. So they describe. So a case study is one example of a descriptive study. So in a case study, we study one individual or one animal in depth in hopes of discovering things that are true about all of us. Okay, so we see in the slide, a researcher is working with a chimp to examine whether or not language is uniquely human. Okay, in the chapter on biological psychology, we'll look at a case study of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage worked in the 1800s, laying down railroad ties for railroad companies, and there was an explosion and a large metal tamping iron went up through his chin, through his brain, out the top of his head. And so people thought he had died, but he hadn't. He survived the accident, but there were many changes in his behavior and personality that were observed after he recovered from the accident. Now, one of the things we need to be careful about is individual cases can mislead us. So an individual, let's say like Phineas Gage, could have been atypical of other people. So for example, on average, smokers die younger than non-smokers. But someone might say, but my uncle is 95 and he smoked 2 packs a day. So this is an atypical person. This is a case of one. So one case study may not generalize to the entire population. They can tell us a lot about behavior if, in fact, that person is typical of the population at large. Another famous case study that we'll look at in psychological disorders is the case of Chris Sizemore in the 1950s. A movie was made about her. She had dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder, and she had 3 separate personalities. And this intense case study helped other professionals understand multiple personality disorder. So those are the kinds of things you can't produce in the lab. You can't create. You don't want to traumatize someone to see if they develop dissociative identity disorder. You're not going to ram a tamping rod through someone's head. So case studies usually can't be produced in a laboratory situation. Another descriptive method is a survey. Surveys look at many cases, but in less depth than a case study. And so, as you see on the slide, it's a way to ascertain the self-reported attitudes, opinions, or behaviors of people, and they're usually done by questioning a representative, random sample of people. So in surveys, we want a representative sample, a group that accurately reflects the larger population we're interested in knowing about. And so oftentimes we use random samples. We might use a table of random numbers. Now, your text cites Share Heights study, which was called Women and Love. And what she did was mail surveys to an unrepresentative sample of 100,000 women. She didn't realize it was unrepresentative when she conducted the study. So these were all women who were members of women's organizations. Okay, so they weren't representative of all women in this country. So 4,500 responded. That was 4%, and that's a pretty typical response rate in a survey. Her study was featured on the cover of Time magazine. And what it said was that 70% of married women were having extramarital affairs, and 95% of the women reported feeling unhappy in their marriages. Okay. So when people looked at the sample, they realized her sample was amiss and it wasn't representative. So other studies were conducted with random samples, and these studies showed that only 1 in 7 had an affair, and more than 50% of women reported being satisfied and happy in their marriage. So went from 70% to 14% when we used appropriate survey methods. So in a random sample, everyone in a group has an equal chance of participating. So it's really important if you're reading research, you want to know how they sampled the population they studied. So there are problems with call-in phone samples, website polls. Oftentimes these are people who are really invested or interested in the topic, and they don't represent the larger population. In creating a survey, researchers need to be very careful about wording. Okay, wording can change the results of a survey. So you see on your slide, should cigarette ads and pornography be allowed on television? Okay, it could have said, should cigarette ads be forbidden on TV? So certain words can predispose people to answer in a particular direction. Other examples, people are more approving of aid to the needy than welfare. People are more approving of affirmative action than preferential treatment. So I could go on and on with examples. In a testing course, you would be taught how to be cautious about wording when you create a survey. The third descriptive method is naturalistic observation. So researchers observe and record the behavior of animals in the wild. They also observe and record human behavior. You see on the slide the recording of self-seating patterns in a multiracial school lunchroom constitutes naturalistic observation. And so we can't conclude causation when we do an observational study, but it can give us some good information about behavior. Now, there's some limitations to naturalistic observation. Observations can be biased. A person can see what they expect to see. A behavior can also be altered by the presence of an observer. So if the president came into your classroom, the president of Thomas More University came in to observe, I might be a little different, you might be a little different, maybe some of you would be quieter, others would be more interactive, and so the presence of an observer can alter behavior. So we need to keep this in mind when we conduct a naturalistic observational study. The second type of study is a correlational study. Okay, so we have descriptive studies, 3 types of those, and now we'll look at correlational studies. So in a correlational study, we're looking at the relationship between 2 variables, between 2 things. So when one trait or behavior accompanies another, we say the 2 correlate. So a correlation is a statistical measure of the relationship between the 2 variables. It's called a correlation coefficient. And so the correlation coefficient tells us how closely 2 things vary together. And thus it tells us how well one variable predicts the other, but not necessarily causes the other. So I want you to memorize that, to know that through and through. A strong correlation might say one thing predicts another, but we can't with any certainty say that one thing causes the other unless we conduct an experiment. So if you look at the slide, you see R. So correlation coefficients are expressed as R values, and R can range from -1 to +1. So a perfect negative correlation would be -1. A perfect positive correlation would be +1. So here we have an R value of positive 0.37. So we have, a mild or moderate positive correlation. So a positive correlation means that both variables vary in the same direction. So as weather or as temperature increases, numbers of aggressive behaviors increase. The 2 are increasing together, so you would have a positive correlation. Okay, if you have a negative R value, it's going to tell you that the 2 variables change inversely. So as self-esteem goes up, depression goes down. So there's an inverse relationship with a negative R value. So your slide says correlation does not mean causation. So again, that's really important to know. So back to the example of low self-esteem and depression. These are negatively correlated. As self-esteem goes down, depression goes up, and vice versa. And so low self-esteem could cause depression, or depression could cause low self-esteem. Or distressing events or biological predispositions could cause low self-esteem and depression. Okay, so the 2 are negatively correlated, but one doesn't necessarily cause the other. So let's say, to give you another example, that psychologists discover a certain chemical found in the blood of people suffering from schizophrenia, and they don't find this chemical in people not suffering from schizophrenia. So does this mean the chemical causes schizophrenia? Not necessarily. The chemical could be caused by some unknown third factor. Let's say the diet in a psychiatric hospital, or it could be caused by the side effect of a medication. Okay. Your textbook talks about a correlation between the number of churches in American cities and the number of bars. The more churches, the more bars. So does that mean religion makes you thirsty? Does it mean drinking makes you religious? Of course not. The number of churches and bars are related to the population size of cities. Okay, there's a positive correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks. So once again, shark attacks don't cause people to buy more ice cream or vice versa. Okay, this is summertime behavior. So in order to be confident of a cause and effect relationship, you need to perform a controlled experiment. Many factors influence our behavior. So an experiment does two important things. One, it manipulates or varies factors that are of interest to us, while all other factors or variables are kept under control. So manipulation and control. So effects generated by manipulated factors isolate cause and effect relationships. So I'm going to talk more about this as I go through the slide. So just to give you an example of an experiment we'll come back to in social psychology and in the chapter on learning, Albert Bandura in the 1960s was interested in whether aggressive behavior was learned by way of observation of aggressive models. And so his hypothesis was that children who observed an adult behaving aggressively would be more likely to act aggressively than children who observed adult models who did not act aggressively. And so he set up an experiment with nursery school children who were randomly assigned to two groups. One group of children observed an aggressive model, and the other group observed a non-aggressive model. And I'll talk about the outcomes of his study as we go through the slides here. So in drug research and drug therapies, it's important that the patient and the experimenter's assistant remain unaware of who is getting the actual drug and who is getting the placebo. So a placebo, as you may know, is an inert substance such as a sugar pill or a saline injection, a salt injection. And so we know that if we expect something to happen, it just might happen. And so we want both the experimenter's assistant and the patient or the subject not to be aware. So we call this double blinding. So Rosenthal, back in the 1960s, studied expectancy effects, which he called self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, this wasn't on drug therapies, but what he did was get a group of children who all took IQ tests at the beginning of a school year and then randomly assigned these students to various teachers. They were all at the same grade level. Some of the teachers were told that they had a classroom full of intellectual bloomers. Some other teachers were told that they couldn't expect a lot from these kids, that these were kids who struggled intellectually. And so at the end of the year, they were evaluated, and the students whose teachers were told that they didn't have a lot of intellectual brain power, if you will, Those students did not do very well, and yet these students had all been randomly assigned. Okay, in the classrooms where the teachers were told that the students were just, really bright and to expect a lot, those kids excelled. And again, you need to keep in mind they were all randomly assigned. And so what the experimenter expects to find can actually have an impact on the outcome of the study. And so we have double-blind procedures in drug therapies. Your textbook talks about an experiment in which the experimenter wants to see if there are long-term effects on breastfed infants versus formula-fed infants. And so one of the first things we would want to do in examining the impact of breastfeeding on intelligence is to randomly assign, people to the study. So sometimes research participants, out of enthusiasm or personal belief, can affect the outcome of an experiment. So to control for such effects, as I said before, a double-blind procedure is used in which participants and the experimenter's assistants are not aware of which participants got real treatment and who got placebo. So in this study, the impact of breastfeeding on intelligence, we randomly assign participants to one of two groups. One group is the experimental group, that's the breastfed infants, and the other is the control group, the formula-fed infants. Okay, so we randomly assign mothers and their infants to these two different groups in order to minimize any other pre-existing differences between the two groups. So we're controlling all other variables by way of randomly assigning people to two groups. So we don't put all the people who signed up first into the experimental group and the other into the control group. Okay, we randomly assign our pool of subjects. Okay, the independent variable is the factor we manipulate or we vary in the experiment. And the effect of the independent variable, or IV, is the focus of the study. And so in the example of the effects of breastfeeding on intelligence, breastfeeding is the independent variable. We're manipulating this. One group gets breastfed, the other group doesn't. And so it is the focus of the study, the IV. The dependent variable, or DV, is the factor that might change in response to an independent variable. So it's usually a behavior or a mental process in a psychological study. So in this example, in the study of the effect of breastfeeding on intelligence, intelligence is the dependent variable. Okay, so intelligence is what we measure. So the dependent variable is what is measured. So this is a good slide that summarizes the steps that an experimenter takes when conducting a psychological experiment. So the very first thing the experimenter does after collecting a pool of subjects is to control for other variables like parental intelligence, in this example, environment, by way of randomly assigning mothers and their infants to either the experimental or the control group. Okay, so in the experimental group, we have breastfed infants. In the control group, we have formula-fed infants. And then at age 8, we measure intelligence. So what we measure is the dependent variable. So we look at the intelligence of the breastfed infants and of the formula-fed infants, and we calculate whether or not there's a significant difference in intelligence between these two groups of infants. So this is a good comparison chart of the different research methods. So I highly encourage you to use this as a study guide when you're studying for quizzes and tests on Chapter 1, excuse me. Now what I want to do on this slide is to give you a few more examples of experiments. So let's say you want to find out if hunger affects memory. So you would get a pool of subjects and you would randomly assign them to two different groups. So in one group, you would give them a memory test while the subjects are hungry. And in the other group, the control group, you would give them the same memory test after the group had eaten a meal. Okay, so you would score the test of memory and you would compare the average memory scores to see if hunger impacts memory. So we're looking at cause and effect. So in the simplest psychological experiment, you have two groups. We can have more than two groups, but for introductory psychology, we'll talk about two groups. So again, one's the experimental group, the second's the control group. And both groups are treated exactly alike, except for the one condition you intentionally vary, and that's the independent variable. So in the experiment I just described, the independent variable is hunger. One group is hungry, the other group is not. The dependent variable is the condition or behavior that's affected by the independent variable. It's what we measure, and in this case, the dependent variable would be memory. Okay, another example. Let's say you observe that you study better while you listen to music. So your hypothesis is that music improves learning. So you want to test this out and you set up a psychological experiment. So you get a group of subjects and you randomly assign your subjects to two groups. The experimental group studies with music. The control group studies without music. Okay, then you test both groups in the same way using the same test and you compare test scores. So what's the independent variable in this experiment? Okay, you're right, the music. And the dependent variable? Yeah, how much is learned? Now, maybe they learned more not because of music, but because the experimental group was smarter. And so you've controlled for this possible outcome by way of random assignment. So in random assignment, subjects have an equal chance of being in either group. So randomization balances out all the other personal or environmental differences. So the independent variable is the only possible cause for any effect noted in the dependent variable. As I mentioned in the introductory video, introductory psychology or general psychology is full of information. And so, especially if you haven't had a course in high school in psychology, it's really important that you carefully read your book, you go through these PowerPoint slides, you participate in class discussion in order to remember the information. Okay, students who do well in this course devote a significant amount of time to the material. And so at the end of the chapter, you find tips for studying psychology. And so they call the best method to study psychology the SQ3R method. So the first is survey. So you look through your book, you look through your slides and survey what you're about to read and listen to, including chapter outlines, and you look at the section headings. Okay? So then you ask some questions, you make some notes based on your survey, and then you begin to read. So look for the answers to your questions by reading a manageable amount at a time. So you don't want to sit down and read your whole chapter or half the chapter like you read a novel. You want to read the chapter in chunks. You want to take notes, jot down questions. You'll bring your questions to discussion in class. Okay, so reading the slides, listening to the audio, reading the textbook is very important. And then rehearsal is very important. You want to recall what you've heard and what you've read in your own words. So test yourself. You can make study cards, create little quizzes for yourself. I have quizzes online, practice quizzes. You can test yourself with those. There are also little quizzes in the textbook. And then review what you learn, review what you learn, read over your notes, and quickly review the whole chapter. Okay, if you have any questions, please email me or come to class, to the discussion groups with questions that you have as you listen to the slides and you read the textbook. So good luck and study hard.